Well, what you've just been looking at is a collection of work produced on paint boxes around the world. Some of the pieces have been produced using an entry-level system, and some have been produced using all of the options available. What we're going to do over the next few minutes is go through the basics of driving a paint box. Now, we're not going to do this box by box because I think so much of the system is very self-explanatory and intuitive. So what we're going to do is perhaps lay down more of a set of guidelines to help you produce very quickly specific results. Now, before we go into the menus themselves on the system, let's look at the system itself and just see how it's broken down into its various pieces of hardware. Well, in front of me now we have an entry-level system, and it's comprised of various separate units. First of all, very obviously in front of me is the tablet, which is of course pen-driven, and right in front of me is the monitor, which is of course my window on the work we're producing. To my left is a keyboard, and on the right-hand side I have a magneto-optical drive, a rat, and the entry-level system itself. Now let's have a look at that as a screen graphic. And here we can see, so there we are, there are all the pieces of equipment that we are using to produce all the work that we're going to see over the next few minutes. Very, very simple to use. Inside the Paintbox drive itself is a 525 megabyte hard drive. That will store several hundred images, probably in the region of 500 separate images, be they cutouts or pictures or stencils. The magneto-optical drive will store, again, in the region of 700 pictures, images, cutouts, stencils, whatever. And those, of course, are removable discs. The keyboard is used to perform various functions on the system, mainly text setting, and the rat is used as a secondary control with the pen to allow you to manipulate cutouts on the screen. So that's a very brief overview of the equipment involved. What we're going to do now, as I said, is go through the menus on the system and look at various aspects of driving a paint box. First of all, you'll notice on the left-hand side of the menu we have our main sub-menus, which are Painting, Graphics, Paste Up and Library. Now, the gaps that you see here are in fact filled, of course, later by various options that can be added to the system. So to start with, let's go into the Painting menu. We'll wipe the screen to grey. And you notice the cursor in the centre of the screen there. That is indicating that my pen is in what's known as proximity, which means that it is within something like 10 to 15 millimetres of the tablet's surface. As long as it is in proximity, then I have control over various functions on the system. When the pen is out of proximity, as it is there, then I have no control over any menu or function at all. Now, to bring the menu onto the screen or to take the menu off the screen, I can swipe to the left or right, like so. And then to bring it on again, and of course that works just as well to the right, swipe it off, and from the centre of the screen to the right, swipe it back on again. Now, if I wanted the menu at the top of the screen, then all I need to do very simply is swipe upwards, and the menu will appear at the top of the screen, and then the left hand or right hand swipe will remove or replace the menu like so. And to bring that back to the bottom, I simply swipe down, and the menu is now again at the bottom of the screen and can be brought into the screen by swiping left or right. I suggest when you first start using the system that you actually start with the cursor in the middle of the screen and make a complete move to the left or to the right. As you become more familiar with the system, you'll be able to bring it on with a very small movement indeed. Now, do remember not to apply pressure as you move off the screen. If I just put a different colour onto the pen, you'll see what happens. If I have the menu off and I want to bring it on and apply pressure, then obviously I'm going to put a mark onto the image that I'm working on. So that's very important that in fact you just stay in proximity with the pen. Now, to bring the palette onto the screen, as you saw just then, I simply make a downwards movement with the pen in proximity to bring the palette on or off the screen. And providing we're in that mode, then the same move to the top of the screen will bring the palette up to the top. So that's the very simple process indeed. What we're going to do now is have a look at the palette while we're in this part of the system. On the left hand side I have my primary colours, and I have various areas available to me to mix colour in. On the right hand side I have indicated here the various different pen sizes I can use, and the little box on the far right indicates my current colour. So if I pick up a different colour, you can see there that's changed. Now, to pick a colour off the system, you very simply make a sharp tap on any one of the colours you want to select. And that of course goes for screen colour as well. If I had an image on the screen now, I could just tap down, and here you can see I've picked the screen grey. Now to place a colour into one of the spare palette mixing boxes that we have, then all I simply do is lean on the pen. I don't make a tapping movement, I just lean on the pen for a few seconds, and then the tap to pick another colour back up. Now the central area of the palette is for mixing colours, so if we in fact pick up a red and press now on the pen for the first time, and we mix some red into the palette, tap on the yellow, press more lightly because of course the pen is fully pressure sensitive, and you can see now we've mixed some marginal colours between the yellow and the red, and by tapping on any of these then I can achieve the mixed colour effect that I require. And then of course by removing the palette from the screen, I can then draw on the full image area. So that's the working processes of the palette. If we go back to the menu again, as you've seen from the manuals, we have paint, chalk, airbrush, brush shapes. I don't think we need to go through those at this moment. Of course, they are, as I say, very self-explanatory and intuitive, and I'd like you all to spend some time getting used to using those, and of course using them in conjunction with all the different brush sizes that you will see in the palette. In the painting menu we have various other functions, and if I just again wipe the screen down, you'll notice that on the right-hand side of the screen we have the Stencil Functions. Now this appears in most menus within the system, with very few exceptions. And the object of the stencil, of course, is to enable you to apply a mask or matte to any part of the image. And the stencil has three primary functions. Let's just go into the library and bring down a graphic to show you what these are. Now the stencil will allow us to use a protective mask, firstly, on any part of the image, which is what we'll be looking at in a few moments. It also acts as a shape cutter, which we'll look at later on, and it also has the function of an action mask, allowing you to actually mask off part of an image while moving elements can move in behind or in front of it. So the function of the stencil in the painting and graphic menus is primarily as an artist mask. Now you may well be familiar with Frisk Film or Rubylith or even just straightforward paper stencils. Well, the stencil on Paintbox works in very much a similar way. What I'm going to do now is just bring a graphic onto the screen to try and explain exactly how the stencil works. So here's our pen, here is our canvas, and here in the midground is our stencil, which is shown in red here because most of the time you tend to work with a red stencil to differentiate it from other parts of the image. Well, when you apply a colour through the stencil will mask part of it off, only allowing certain parts of that airbrush to be applied to the background, as you can see there. So I just run that again. The paint is sprayed through the stencil and applies itself to the background, copying, of course, the exact shape of the mask or stencil that you've created. And that is the primary function of the stencil, and as you can see it works in a very traditional way. So let's look at that on the screen now. So if I hit Draw Stencil, I have the facility now to add or remove from the screen, and if I wipe the stencil, I flood the screen with the medium. If I remove and wipe, then I empty the screen from stencil. So add and wipe, or remove and wipe. So in this instance, I will in fact add stencil to a clean background, and using a paintbrush, just apply some of the red film, if you like, to the screen. Now that can be reversed and used either way round, and by using the stencil I can actually now apply a colour through that. Let's pick up a blue, and you can see that is only applying through the stencil area. Now if I want to, I can actually display the stencil while I'm applying that, like so, or of course I can use it invisibly. One of the other functions of the stencil is to reverse it, to enable me to apply colour outside the image I've already created. So now I'm applying colour to the background. So you can very quickly see how the various different functions within stencil operate. And I think one of the easiest ways to try and appreciate the workings of the stencil system is to imagine, if you like, that you have two separate paint boxes. One is an image creator and the other is a stencil creator. And regardless of the menu function you're in any part of the system, if you have Draw Stencil switched on, you will be creating a stencil. If you have Draw Stencil switched off, you'll be creating the image itself. Again, perhaps this little graphic will explain precisely how that works. So imagine, if you will, that you have two separate systems. One is an image system, one is a stencil system. So almost, it's like, as I say, having two paint boxes in one, if we put the stencil to one side and the picture to the other. Alright, what we'll do now is produce an example using the stencil, painting and graphics functions within the system to help you understand more fully the operational aspects of the stencil and how it actually works in each of its different states. So what we're going to do is produce a circle, first of all, by having Draw Stencil active, and in the graphics menu we'll select a solid circle. And you notice here the little blue box is telling me that I've got the paintbrush style selected in the painting menu. So I simply swipe off the screen, tap down, pull out, and we've created a hard edge circle on the screen. Hard edge, of course, because we used a paintbrush rather than an airbrush. And as I said earlier, because we're in the Draw Stencil mode, regardless of the menu we're in a stencil part of the paint box. Now I'm going to reverse that stencil, and using it, in fact this time without using the display, we'll pull a rectangle of colour through it. And in the palette area, we'll mix a blue, like so, and we'll pull that through the stencil. And we'll just darken that slightly, like so. So that circle has been created by using the stencil. Now in painting, we'll now select an airbrush, change the density by moving the pen up and down the screen whilst the density value box is open, and we'll select a white airbrush. And now very simply apply some shading to the sphere. And again we can pick colour from screen, like so, and then change perhaps to a darker colour and put a shadow around the bottom of the image. So you can immediately see here how the stencil is being used to protect the background of the image. Having created that effect, if we wanted now to put a shadow onto the background, all we need to do is very simply reverse the stencil, so now the foreground is being protected and the background is available for us to paint on. And of course, again, we use the stencil, pick up an airbrush and a dark grey, and very simply paint a cast shadow onto the background, like so. So very quickly you can get a feel for how the stencil works in painting and graphics functions. Now the second function, if we just save that image to one side and go back into the library, we've just looked at the protective masking facility that the stencil offers us. The second use of the stencil perhaps would be as a shape cutter, and let's see how that would work. So if we bring the image back again, we have a stencil that depicts the shape of the ball. We reverse that again, and now in fact we'll move into paste up, and we'll cut the picture and the stencil together, giving us both the shape information and the fill information, like so. And we now have that element of the screen cut out as a shape through its stencil, which we can now move around the screen and place anywhere that we desire. And of course we can reduce the size of it and move it around the screen and replace it. Now the third use of the stencil was as an action mask. And if we bring back the image again, there is our stencil or mask. Let's reverse that and use it in conjunction with the cutout, and now you'll see it will move behind the sphere, creating, if you like, a third plane. So those are the three primary uses of the stencil, and you'll come across those again and again in various menus throughout the system. So that just about rounds up all of the painting and stencil functions. Obviously I'd like you to spend some time getting to know them better, using them, creating your own examples and exercises to better understand the use and interaction of painting and stencil. And don't forget, it's very important to remember that the system is, as I said before, effectively two paint boxes, a stencil paint box and an image paint box. And almost totally without exception, regardless of the menu you're in, the system will work in both modes, either as a painting system or as a stencil creation system. So always remember to check what mode you're in, check if you're in Draw Stencil, check if you're in Use Stencil, or check if you've actually got both functions switched off. As long as you remember that at all times, I think you'll find your way through the system very quickly and very easily. Alright, what we're going to do now is move down the sub-menus, and we're going to look at the second sub-menu on the left-hand side of the screen, which of course is Graphics. Now, if we go back to the menu now and bring up Graphics, you'll notice that you have now a new set of menus in the screen here. Still we have the familiar stencil, both in Use and Draw on the right hand side, because of course, as I said before, all of the functions actually operate in nearly all of the menus with very little exception. And I think the easiest way to describe these is, if you like, to liken them to a geometry set, because that's exactly what it is. It's a series of facilities that enable you to produce lines, rectangles, circles, ellipses, and again, very intuitive, very, very straightforward to use. So we're not going to go into those in too great a detail. Basically, of course, it enables you to produce these kinds of shapes. Directly from the other image, you can see we have straight lines, right angles, horizontals and verticals, circles, some filled, some outline, ellipses, graduations in any direction. As I say, a complete set of tools that enable you to produce the technical drawing aspect of all of your graphics creation on the system. We'll look at one or two elements in here though. For example, don't forget that whatever we produce in graphics is going to pick up the paint style. So here, for example, you see we have paint. If we go into painting and change that to airbrush, pick up a circle, create a solid one, pick a brush size, tap down in the center of the circle, pull out, tap down again to confirm, and there you can see we've created a soft-edged solid circle. And if we'd had a chalk brush, the same thing would have applied. Let's switch that back to painting, to a paintbrush, and now into ellipses, outline say, smaller brush, tap down in the center, pull out, and depending on how far you move on the X or Y scales, you will create a different angled ellipse. And then again, of course, tap down to confirm. One of the other functions in the graphics menu is the fill function, and what this allows you to do is, let's say if you're working in stencil, for example, and you've created an irregular shaped outline, like so, then you can very quickly fill that by using the fill function in graphics, by tapping inside that shape. Whatever you fill, you must have a closed border around it. Now the last function we're going to look at in graphics is the grid function. If we just wipe the picture to black. The electronic grid within the system allows us to create any grid pattern across the whole screen or part of the screen, and we can determine the size of that grid by putting different values in the horizontal and vertical boxes in the sub-menu, either by scrolling up and down the screen with the pen or by actually putting a number into the box using the soft keypad, like so. Now that's applied to the entire screen, the whole screen. We can, of course, determine a specific part of the screen to have that grid applied to, like so, and that can then be moved around by using the pen to scroll it across the screen. So a very simple and effective grid system. Now, as I said before, don't forget all of the functions work just as equally in stencil as they do in image creation, so that of course is applicable at all times. Right, so that's a very brief look at graphics, and again, as I say, please do spend some time trying it for yourselves, trying each of the different functions, try the different brush types, see which is most effective. Really get to know it before you move on to the next step. But what we're going to do now is, using the stencil and the painting and the graphics functions which we've been looking at, and perhaps dipping into one or two new areas on the system, we're going to create a very simple and straightforward graphic now. And for our example this time, we're going to use a current affairs graphic. Now what I want to do is, first of all, create a flag background over which I'm going to half mix a photograph. So the first stage is to wipe our canvas or screen down with a flat colour. So I've taken an off-white here. Then in the painting menu I'm going to select a colour. In this instance we're going to mix a deep red, and then very simply and easily create a loose painted flag background. And of course you choose a brush size that most suits the application that you're working on. To change colour then I can very simply pick up the blue and add another shape in here, and perhaps now I could use the fill function that we looked at a few moments ago to fill in the colour. We'll just take the centre out of that, like so, and then a little line of red, and you can see the brush, the flag beginning to take shape on the screen. Well, what I'll do now is, just to save a few moments, go into the library and bring down one that I've been working on. There we are. So there is my flat painted flag, created using the painting functions within the entry-level system. Now what I'm going to do, before I go any further, is save this into one of our 2 temporary frame stores. And they're sitting here on the right-hand side of the screen, called Old and New. Now, there is no difference between them. It doesn't matter which one we save into, providing, of course, there's nothing already in there that we need to save. So I'm going to save this image in the Old Picture Store, and it's saved along with any current stencil that's applied to that picture. Right, well now what I'm going to do is wipe the screen to black, and I could very easily save that then in the other temporary picture store. So if you like, at any one time I have 3 stores on screen. I have the old store, the new store, and of course the current screen that we're looking at. Now what I'm going to do in this instance is to create a ripple effect on the flag. I'm going to restore through, using an airbrush, to the old picture store, which of course if I tap it will show us as a preview that we have the Union Jack flag in there. And when I take my when I take the pen off the box, you'll notice that it reverts to the picture I'm currently looking at. So I'm picking a large airbrush, I'm now applying that across the screen and restoring part of that flag. Change the brush size, like so. And I can change the intensity of that restoration by reducing the density of the airbrush. So we've then created a sort of a ripple effect across the screen on that flag. And then if, just as a finishing touch, if I wanted to, take the restore function off, I'm just going to add a few little highlights using white onto the screen like so. Okay, now if I'm happy with that result, then I can save that into one of my 2 temporary stores, and in this instance I'll use the new store, because of course you can use these 2 stores as a safety net, if you like, so that we're saving stages every few minutes. So if something went wrong, I could very simply revert back to my last stage and lose perhaps only a minute or 2's production time. Right, so that's the first step, produced and saved in the new picture store. I'm going to go into the library and bring down an image, this time of a photograph of Westminster, to lay over the foreground. There's the picture, which of course by hitting Browse I can view, tap on it, and it's brought down into our current frame buffer. So now in fact we can see the 3 stores that we have. Here's our current store, there's the new store, and there's the old store. And what I want to do in fact is now save this picture, the Westminster picture, onto the old picture store, bring back my flag, check that that's the one I want to work with, and then simply restore through from one image to the other, again using the same process we used a few moments ago when we were creating the flag. I'm using a less dense airbrush now so that it's rather more subtle. And then just down here in the water, like so. So there is the background that I want to work with. Now in the foreground I need to add our main character, which in this instance is going to be the Prime Minister John Major. So back onto the library, and I'll look for a picture. Bring that down to the screen, and here we can see the image that we want to work with. Now back into the stencil mode, making sure the screen is clean, and we'll now paint an outline around the image to enable us to cut him from the background. And I'm going to use the zoom function here, which will allow me to work in greater detail on each part of the image. So now very simply by hand I'm going to trace around the outline, and once I've moved off the screen, then with the menu on screen I can move the image across like so, so I have a new window on that close-up. And then move it again, and that's the principle by which we create that stencil outline. So what I'll do now is go back into the library and bring down a finished stencil that we've been working on, and there you can see the result. Now of course what we've done here is created the outline and then filled it using the fill function in graphics. If we reverse it, this of course is the area of the picture that we're interested in, and in paste up now, using cut, picture and stencil together, in other words the shape and the fill information, cutting those two together will remove the image from the background. And this is done very simply by using the crosshairs to select the area you're interested in, or of course if it happens to be the full screen, hitting cut all. And if we now bring back our background, go into paste up, and there is our foreground image on the end of our pen, and we're able to move that anywhere on the screen. And of course, using the statistical criteria within the paste up menu, I could, for example, reduce the size of this particular cutout, like so. Position on the screen, perhaps readjust the size slightly. We have full control over the angle and the position and the size. Stick the image down, and what I want to do now is in fact create a shadow behind that image. So using the draw stencil mode, as I say, of course it works in every menu, and here we are in paste up and we've got draw stencil on, so we have effectively a stencil paste up menu. We'll stick that image down again as a stencil, which protects that part of the screen. Use the stencil, and now by selecting the stencil style box on the screen, we can now pick any colour as a substitute for our fill image picture of John Major, and then we can very simply move that, what looks like a silhouette, to either side, reduce the density value of it by using the percentage box here in paste up, like so. Perhaps reposition the cutout and then simply stick it down, and there we have a drop shadow effect on our foreground information. So that's the next step. We'll save that to one side. I'd like to add a title to this now, but rather than just putting a title straight on the screen, we're going to create a little banner or box overlay. So to do this, first of all, again, we create a stencil. Always remember, if you want to create a separate element onto a screen, do create a stencil first, because it gives you the opportunity to cut it out and move it and save it on the library without perhaps applying a final colour to it. So do always remember to do that first. So a solid rectangle in stencil, pull it across the screen and tap down, reverse the stencil and now use it. And going back into the palette, we'll select a colour we want to work with, a mid blue, so we'll just pick up that sort of colour. Graphics, rectangle solid, using the stencil, pull a rectangle through the protected area of the screen, or the unprotected area of the screen I should say. And now using the stencil again, what we'll do is we'll mix a slightly paler blue and we'll put a bevel edge on the top, and we'll mix a slightly darker blue and put a shadow on the bottom, like so. Now again, by using the stencil I could perhaps enhance that by putting highlights and shadows onto it, and that would be simply achieved by creating a protection mask for the middle of that banner box, and then using an airbrush, just increase the density of it slightly, putting shadows and highlights on various parts of the box. Okay, so now we want to put a title in here. Back in Paste Up, we notice that we have the ability to cut not only the picture or the stencil or both together, but also to cut text. And loaded into the text menu at the moment, we have one of 3 current typefaces we can use. And what I'm going to do is first of all set it at 50 lines in height, and we'll set in capitals the word Westminster. Now, of course, this is where I could be using the keyboard instead of the soft key menu you see on the screen. Reduce the size a little more. We can always reduce the size after we've produced the text. And of course, we've got the ability to produce more than one line of text. And of course, we can change the kerning either by the entire line, by the entire screen, or by single letter. So for example, here, I could open up the gap between the S and the T, like so. And of course we can change the baseline of each letter as well, but in this instance I'm quite happy with that layout as it is. So now of course we select a colour, and I'm going to select this colour in fact from the screen, not from the palette area. So we tap on the border of our banner, and there you can see the lettering taking up that colour. Simply stick it down, and again if I wanted to here, if I wanted to put a shadow on this, all I need to do is very simply add that text now as a stencil, so it protects the text area, and then simply use the stencil, and back in Paste Up we'll select this time a very dark blue for the text. We'll cut it out so it's on the end of our pen, and then we simply move it away from behind our foreground text till we're happy with the position, and then stick it down. And there we have the completed graphic. Very, very simple and quick to create. Drawing upon the various functions we've been looking at earlier on in this tape: stencils, graphics, painting, and of course now Paste Up. Very simple to produce, and I'd like you to go away and try and produce some of your own using the same sort of principles. Pick various different examples, produce backgrounds, find photographs for foregrounds that you can cut out, and blend your own images and find out exactly what the different functions enable you to do. Now, having produced this picture, of course, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to save it on the library. So let's move into the last menu in the entry-level system and see how the functions operate in this particular sub-menu. So the library, of course, is our management system. It allows us to save and retrieve all of the images that we're working on, whether they're cutouts or stencils or pictures or grids, any type at all. So in fact we have a sub-menu called Types, and here we can see pictures and stencils and palettes and cutouts. And if we save this picture, then the process we'd go through would be save, name, types, picture, and we'll call that Westminster Final number 1. And I'm going to put that onto my system drive, so I select the local as opposed to the exchange box, and that will now save onto the system drive of the disk. Now if I want to find that picture, I simply hit Find, Types, well it's a picture, so I select the picture menu. The name is Westminster Final, and I can type the whole name or an abbreviation of it. I can put West and Final. So we select the local drive, hit the end box, and there it is. We can browse that now in the full page menu, or of course we can fetch it by tapping it or by tapping the title. If we want to know more about the picture, we have information available on it. Westminster Final, the file type, the disk it sits on, and the date and the time that it was produced. Now when we're saving and retrieving images on the system, we have 6 different category types that we can actually file under. And if we bring those up now, we can see here a name. Obviously everything can be given a different name. It has a type, in this instance a picture, the disk it goes to. You can put an owner name on it, so here I could put my initials if I wanted to, so that I knew it belonged to me. Categories, I could put here news, and a description. If I wanted to, I could put any copyright information or information on who was in the picture, so in this instance I could put John Major, and then perhaps Westminster, so we know what the makeup of the picture is. So we have 6 different areas which we can file under and retrieve under. We also have the ability, of course, when you bring down a picture, to retitle it. We see here we're given the opportunity to retitle an image, and I may decide that I wanted to call this version 2, and that very simply is now updated on the disk. And again, as I said, really all of these menus are intuitive and very, very straightforward and easy to understand. So again, spend some time working with the library, saving images, retrieving them and retitling them, giving them categories and owners, and I'm sure you'll find many, many uses for all of the different sub-categories that you can apply to each one of the images. So there's one last area we're going to look at on the entry-level system, and that's the full page menu. Most importantly, the artist or user setups, because I think it's very important that when you're using the system that you can set it up with your own preferences, the way that you prefer to work. So let's have a quick look at those. First of all, we've got the ability to switch the cursor on or off, and that means that if the cursor is off, when you're using pressure on the pen, the cursor will disappear, enabling you, of course, to work on very fine detailed material without masking it with a cursor. The confirm function allows you to have a second chance to wipe perhaps a screen with an image on it. The Qwerty menu, of course, allows you to have a QWERTY or an alphabetical keyboard, and the safe area allows you to set up any size safe grid, either safe title, safe action, for images that you're working on. And we have various other things like, of course, engineering color bars, and within the full page menu you'll find the menus that allow you to set up the system to configure various peripherals in and out of the system, and of course to enable you to load new typefaces and to initialize magneto-optical discs for use on the system. So there it is, the entry-level system. I hope this has been a useful session for you. As I said at the beginning, I didn't want to go through a box-by-box explanation because the manual is going to help you with that far more than I can. What I want to do is actually show you some working examples using an entry-level system, and I hope now it'll give you the chance to go off, find your own original material and build your own examples and exercises so you can get to fully understand the system, and in no time at all you'll be producing very finished and highly competent work using the entry-level system. So the first of the options that we're going to take a look at now is the special brush option, and that can be found in the painting menu. And here we can see on the screen now we have the addition of several new functions. Those are namely shade, smudge, copy, smooth, blur and crisp. And each of these functions will have a different effect on the images that you're working on. So let's go into the library now and bring down a picture to work on, and here we have a picture of a house which has been fed in on a standard video camera. And back into the painting menu, and we'll select shade. Now shade will allow us to alter the luminance levels of a picture without affecting the chrominance levels. So if I just pick black in this particular instance and select an airbrush, then by moving across part of the image and applying shade to it, what I'm actually doing is just darkening the back of this house. I'm not changing the colour levels in any way at all, I'm just changing the luminance levels. And you can see the effect that's being created there. If I then pick a white brush and move across the end of the house, then you can see again there that the whole of the image there has been lifted in luminance level, but again without affecting the chrominance. So you can see obviously with the use of masking and different brushes we could achieve a light cast effect on any object, and of course in this instance a house. So there's the shade brush. And if we just save this image to one side, we'll now have a look at the copy brush. The copy brush allows us to pick up any texture or picture information on the screen and translate it across the screen to another selected area. So for example, if I wanted to lose this path and actually put grass in its place, then all I need to do is, of course, first of all select a brush size and type, tap down on the screen where I'm copying from, move the rectangle out and tap again where I'm copying to, and now I can very simply translate that grass texture across the screen like so. And obviously with careful selection you can achieve extremely effective results. So that's the copy brush, and of course again that will work in any of the different paintbrush styles and any of the different sizes as well. The smudge brush allows me to literally treat the picture as if it were wet paint, and I'm going to select another picture now from the library. In this instance the same picture of the house, but we've done some more retouching now, and we've actually put a reflection on the house in a river in front of it. And the river ripples have been created using the smudge brush. So if we go back and select smudge, and this time a paintbrush, we can see how that works. As I say, it appears that the image actually has effectively a wet paint effect to it. If we zoom in and move to a specific part of the image, then you can see I'm literally dragging specific colours across the screen. So whatever colour I actually pick up is smudged across the image. As I say, it's just as if the image was still wet. And there you can see that smudge ripple effect that we've created there. And you can use that with an airbrush to create perhaps a motion blur effect on the back of a fast car. Now the smooth, blur and crisp brushes all affect the image in terms of focus. So for example, if we wanted to blur part of the image, let's say these trees in the background, we wanted to soften them and put them slightly out of focus, then we could very simply select the blur, and in this instance an airbrush, and just soften them. And you can see there that we've actually effectively dropped focus on the background. And likewise, in the opposite effect, I could select crisp and then select part of the foreground of the image and literally just pull a little more edge detail onto it, so it gives the impression of being even more in focus. So using those two brushes, crisp and blur, we can achieve a depth of field in our imagery. And the smooth brush is a halfway house, if you like. It's actually a very subtle blur. So that's just about it really. Those are all of the special brushes. Very simple and straightforward to use. Hopefully what I've shown you now is a few applications which will help you to decide how to implement those new options on your Paintbox system. The Paintbox Effects option concentrates mainly on the areas of colour correction and keying. So we're going to take a few examples now and look at those areas in more detail. First of all though, let's have a look at the effects menu, and you can now see on the left hand side of the screen we have that little gap filled up with the effects sub-menu. And immediately we can see in this area the boxes overlay, field mode, colour map, mosaic and colour fettle. And we'll be having a look at all of those in more detail as we go through this module. So first of all, let's look at overlay, and we'll go into the library and bring down a typical example. Okay, now here we have the Quantol logo that's been fed into the system on a video camera, and unfortunately we didn't have a very good example of the logo, and it's on a piece of paper that's obviously been creased and it hasn't been lit particularly well. So rather than having a black and white to key from, we've got dark greys and pale greys. Now the overlay in the effects option gives us the facility to choose the levels that we key from, the luminance levels that we actually key the picture through. So these two little boxes to the right hand side of the overlay box indicate the highlights and the lowlights that we are selecting to produce a key level. So as I move around the screen with the palette up, I can select any particular colour and plant it in the left hand box, for example, any particular second colour and plant it in the other box, and then those two levels will be the key that we set up our picture on. So what we need to do in this instance, of course, is choose the darkest highlight, which is around about that part of the screen, and place that in one side, and then the lightest low light, which is probably around about that part of the screen. Place that into the left hand box and then run an overlay across the whole screen. And if I now wipe the picture to black and hit Draw Sten, you can see that we've actually separated the foreground element from the background. And if we reverse that, we could use that now to pull a colour through, like so. So that's one of the primary uses of the overlay function. Now, whilst you're actually producing an overlay, if we just reselect it from the library, we're able, once we've set up that particular level, to use the Icon and the key facilities, which are also found with the effects option. And if I hit Icon, it gives me an immediate black and white reference of the stencil I've just created. And if I hit key, it keys the area that I've selected over a neutral grey background, and I can move that image around the screen and check all areas to make sure the key is all right. Now, one of the other uses for overlay is to produce a half-tone image from any picture that's been fed into the system. So again, if we go back into the library and select a different shot, okay, again there's a colour frame that's been taken from a video rush that's been fed into the system, and what I'll do is now go back into the overlay menu and I'll select again the highlight from the sky and the lowlights from the shadows in the foreground. I'm able now to produce a half-tone overlay of the whole screen. Now, I don't in fact need to produce an overlay of the whole screen. If I want to, I can just produce an overlay of a specific area, as we see just there. But in this instance, we'll run an overlay across the entire screen. Now, if I remove the original image, there you can see we have a half-tone. And if I reverse that, it's a positive half-tone. Now, using that, I could now pull a white rectangle, for instance, across the screen and produce an effect using the overlay. And again, if we reverse that stencil, you'll notice that I have effectively a black and white equivalent of that picture. But of course, I'm not restricted to colour here. I could use any set of colours I wanted. So I could, for example, wipe the picture down in blue and then use a pale blue to reveal the picture. Or of course, I could use it to airbrush through. So if we again wipe the picture down to white, use the stencil, and this time in negative form, and I'm going to use a chalk brush to reveal particular parts of the image. So there you can see how you can actually use an overlay to produce an illustrative effect on the screen. Alright, let's move into the next section of the effects menu. Field mode, I think, is self-explanatory. It allows you to select either field 1 or field 2 of a piece of moving footage. Colour map perhaps is a little more complex. So again, let's go back into the library and bring down a colourful image. And we'll save that on one of our 2 temporary picture stores. And back into the effects menu, we'll have a look at colour map and see how it works. Colour map allows you to reselect colours for specific areas of the screen by tonal value. So in other words, what happens is the system will look at the screen in terms of luminance levels. So in other words, this area of the screen will be quite dark, this area is obviously quite light. And using the palette as 100 to 0% grayscale, it will reinsert colours that you have set up in the palette. Perhaps you'll understand that more easily if I actually run an example through here. So if I select the airbrush, and let's say select a dark blue, and place that on the left-hand side of the palette, with perhaps a little black, what's going to happen now is that everything that is dark grey to black is going to become dark blue to black. Then at the other end of the scale, I can insert, say, a yellow to white, and now everything that is very pale on the screen will become yellow or white. And then through the midsections, I can add other colours. Now, I'm adding very bright colours here so you can get a good idea of the effect that we're actually creating. But of course, you can create extremely subtle duotone effects using colour map. There is my palette set up with the colours. In the effects menu, I'll now colour map the whole screen, or again, just part of the screen. And there is the direct correlation of the palette being applied to the picture by tonal value. And that basically is how colour map works. Just one little pointer, the colour map reads down the very centre line of the palette. So what's at the top and the bottom is actually immaterial. And obviously if we used hard lines in here instead of an airbrush, you'd have very hard stepping effects on the screen instead of a soft transition between 2 colours. So that's the colour map function. Let's move on through the system. Mosaic, again, I think is very self-explanatory. It cuts your screen up into pixels of certain sizes that are dictated by the numerics that you add into the horizontal and vertical boxes. And again, you should just try that a few times to see the kind of effects you can create. Now, Colour Fettle is our colour correction facility within Paintbox. And if we go back into the library again, we'll bring down a picture to work with. Now, in this instance, again, we've got a video still, which we'll just save to one side. Now, in Colour Fettle, I have two sub-menus here, Do All and Set Up All. Well, if I've already got a set up Colour Fettle sort of specification that I want to work with, then I literally just have to hit the Do All box. But in this instance, I want to set up something from scratch. So first of all, I'll original all of the statistics in there, so we're back to a clean slate, as it were. And I now have brightness, contrast, cast and saturation control over this image. So I may decide that it's a little dark, so I'll just brighten it slightly. And there in low resolution we see a preview of that actually happening. I may decide the contrast is not quite enough, so again I'll increase that slightly. And perhaps the cast is slightly green, so I'll just reduce that part of the image. So it's warming up slightly, like so. And again, I might decide to put a little more red into it, and a little more blue. I can go into saturation. I may decide that the entire image needs desaturating, so I select all of the colour levels and reduce the entire saturation levels perhaps to 90%. And there again is a low resolution preview. Now I can try the image without committing it, and there we can see our colour correction being added to the picture. And if I'm happy with that, then I can confirm it to the screen by hitting Do It. And now by switching to our old store, we can see the differences between those two images. Now that's quite a subtle colour correction, but of course using that Colour Fettle menu you can actually achieve extremely radical changes to your image. If we in fact come out to the original setup again, this little graph here allows you to take any one of these areas of BY, RC, luminance, or all together, take every element of the image and change it using the graph. And you can achieve, as you can see on the screen, some very radical changes to the original image, like so. So that really rounds up all of the facilities that you'll find in the effects option on Paintbox. And I hope again that's been useful and given you some ideas and some guidelines as to how to actually implement certain parts of that option. In this module we're going to have a look at the paste style option, which of course can be found in the paste up menu. So if we go into that menu now, we notice in fact of course again that we have a lot more facilities available at the end of our pen. The styles themselves are outline, surround, solid, shadow and emboss. Now we're not going to look at each one of those in detail because again it's intuitive and fairly self-explanatory. What we are going to do is just look at one or two other ways to use these particular styles. So if we bring a cutout onto the screen and we'll just reduce the size of it slightly, there may be an instance where I actually want a cumulative effect. I don't want just an outline or just a solid shadow. I actually want a combination of, let's say, a drop shadow and an outline. Now it's important to remember in this instance that the first thing to do is to set up the shadow, because that's behind the outline, because this is a two-stage effect. So let's change the angle of the shadow. Let's increase the density of it just slightly, increase or decrease the length of the shadow, like so. And once we're happy with that level, we commit that stage and stick it down. The second step is then to apply the outline, and we'll select a colour for this from the palette. And there is the outline stage, and stick that down. So there we've successfully accomplished, very simply, a drop shadow with an outline on our foreground object. It has to be done this way round, otherwise the shadow will fall across the edge of the outline. And remember at all times, of course, that you can combine many or all of these effects on any single cutout, but you have to appreciate that you have to apply them at different stages. Now, one of the other ways that you can use, of course, all of these paste style effects is in conjunction with a stencil. So if again we take this logo as our example and first of all create a stencil for it, like so, we'll reverse that stencil and we'll use it in conjunction with one of the graphics facilities we looked at earlier, which of course is a graduated rectangle. And we'll run that up the screen, or perhaps in this instance down, like so. And then back into the Paste Up and Paste Style menu, what we'll do is we'll look at producing a drop shadow in the stencil. So we'll remove from the stencil a solid shadow in actual fact. That is, let's say, 9 units long. Stick that down and then turn to Add on the stencil and put the original cutout back in its position. And what we've now created is a stencil of the shadow. So on the picture itself there is nothing actually yet to be seen, but on the stencil we can see the shadow that we've made. And now we can simply go into the painting menu, select an airbrush, perhaps select a darker blue, just decrease the density slightly on the airbrush, and then apply that through the stencil. Then using one of the special brush options, in this case the shade, we'll add some highlighting into that shadow. And then going into zoom, of course, and selecting an even smaller brush, we can even add highlights to each individual letter. So you can see immediately how flexible these style options are, because not only can we produce the standard, at the touch of a button, solid shadows and drop shadows, outlines and surrounds, we can also produce extremely custom designed shadow and other paste style effects to any particular cutout that we want to work on. The same would go, of course, to perhaps an outline, so we could go back into the Paste Up menu and this time select Outline with the stencil on, stick it down again, reverse it, use it in conjunction with an airbrush again, perhaps this time just picking a white airbrush, and we could just dust a little highlight onto the edge of that at any particular point. So a very brief explanation, but I think you'll agree that it perhaps gives a better idea as to how paste styles can be implemented within any of the graphic material that you're putting together. Now that's the first part of paste styles. Let's go and have a look at the second part, which of course, as we said earlier, was the ability to actually create multiple cutouts on the screen at any one time. If we just reduce this cutout down in size slightly, you'll notice now in this menu I have a copy facility, and by hitting that it will make an instant copy of the cutout that I have on the screen. Now that is an independent cutout, and if I want to I can apply a separate colour to that. So in this instance let's pick a darker blue. So we have one dark blue cutout and one white cutout. Now I can go on copying either one of those, like so. So I have a third cutout, and again I could apply a separate colour to that one again, so in this instance let's make it even darker. So I now have 3 separate cutouts on the screen, and each one of those, as you can see, highlights as my cursor runs into proximity. This is indicating that should I tap the screen at that time, I then take control of that particular cutout, like so. And that control means angle and size and X and Y position, and of course X and Y stretch and squeeze. Now the multiple cutout facility isn't just restricted to cutouts of a similar style. I could go back into the library at this stage and bring down perhaps a totally different kind of cutout altogether. Let's take the cutout of the Prime Minister from the entry-level tape we were looking at a few moments ago, reduce the magnification, and there you can see I now have 4 cutouts on the screen. And I can go on up to a maximum of 99 cutouts. Now the great advantage here, of course, is the ability to actually build up page layouts, seeing all of the elements on screen at the same time. So you may decide that you want to increase the size or change the position of any single element when you can actually see everything together on the screen, because you get the full interaction of every element of your page on the screen at the same time. Now if I want to restrict the control over any single one of those cutouts so that I can't accidentally select a cutout I'm not interested in, then all I do is very simply tap the cutout that I want to control. It tells me that it's cutout number 3, and I then hit the only box, and that now is locked off on that cutout. And no matter what I do on top of the other cutouts, I can't get control of them. They are locked off, and I can easily go back to the original cutout. If I want to change that, then I can simply open that box, decrease its number, for example, and now I have control of cutout number 2. Decrease again, and I have control of cutout number 1, and so on. Now each of these also has what's known as a priority, and if I bring these cutouts in together, you can see that in this instance, these 3 in order of priority are 1 behind everything, 2 sandwiched in between, and 3 in the foreground. And if at any stage I want to change that priority, I can simply do this by, rather than hitting the only box first, I just select the cutout I want to change the priority of, open its current priority numeric box, and decrease or increase it accordingly. And there you can see it move behind the second cutout and now behind the first. And of course that applies to every cutout on the screen. If at any time you move a cutout off the screen, then reselect another cutout, you may experience difficulty in trying to reselect the cutout that's off the screen. All you simply do then is light the only box, put it to the relevant cutout number, and you have control again. Now the other thing to remember, of course, is that every single one of these multiple cutouts can have a different paste style applied to it. So for example, on the white cutout, I could select an outline. On the blue cutout, I could select a surround. And on the black cutout, I may well select a shadow. And on the cutout of John Major, I could perhaps emboss it. So there you can see every cutout is still live and has applied to it a different paste style of its own. And I think again, as a brief overview, that really wraps up all of the major features and functionality of the paste style option. Adding the 3D perspective option to your Paintbox opens up a whole new range of possibilities for picture creation within the system. So again, rather than going through a blow-by-blow account of every box that you'll find in 3D perspective, let's just look at some of the major differences that you'll come across. First of all, you notice, of course, we now have a subdivision in Paste Up, which says 3D. Before we go into the menu, let's go back into the library and bring down a picture to work with. Now obviously, just like Paste Up in 2D, any image we work with in 3D has to be a cutout before you can manipulate it around the screen. So back into Paste Up, and we'll move into the 3D part of the system, and we'll cut just the picture itself from the screen. Okay, that's now on the end of my pen, so I'll just wipe the picture to black. And you notice now we have a whole new menu, and we're working with positional, spin, size and pin characteristics of the image. At any point you can move back into the 2D Paste Up menu just by deselecting 3D. And an important point to take on board here is the fact that basically Paste Up 2D and 3D work totally independently. So let's just set up a size and a position for our 2D cutout. We'll go into 3D now, and you notice that the image has gone back to its original state. And whatever I do with the image now in 3D, when I revert to 2D, it will remember the statistics that I'd previously set up in that part of the system. So you have two totally separate paste up menus, a 2D paste up and a 3D paste up. So back into 3D, and we now have each of our criteria split into three separate sections. So namely, in position we have the X, the Y and the Z boxes, and each one of these allows to move the cutout independently in that plane. If we want to move them the cutout in all three planes at the same time, then we can very simply do that just by tapping the cutout away from the axis, and now we're moving it positionally in the X and Y plane together. By selecting an axis in the menu, we're now only able to move the cutout in one plane, and of course by reselecting the Y axis we select the vertical plane. By selecting the Z axis we're now moving the cutout towards us and away from us. And that is different, very different from sizing a cutout, because we're literally moving it away in 3D space. It's also possible to manipulate the cutout around the screen by using the X, Y and Z coordinates on the axis that is presented in the center of every cutout that we have available on the screen. So if I select the X axis, you can now see that it highlights in pink, and that will mean again that I can only move in the X plane. And again, by selecting the Z axis, I can now increase or decrease its Z position in space. If we move into spin, then now we're working in X, Y and Z in the spin menu, and again this time working on the screen. You notice I can lie the cutout down in the X, spin it in the Y, and of course move it away in the Z. And here's a good example of where perhaps I'd want to use the menu rather than the screen, because the X and the Y coordinates are rather close to each other. So I'd select Z in the menu and then spin on the Z plane. And of course we have the size facility as well, which allows us in any one of the planes to increase perhaps on the X plane, or increase and decrease on the Y plane, or of course by tapping outside the area we are literally sizing and reducing the entire cutout. By hitting original and size, it will take it back to original size. By hitting original and position, we revert to the default position of the cutout, and of course the same for spin. Or of course if I want to regain my original position in every aspect, then I just hit original all and the cutout reverts to its original aspect. So if we wanted to set up a specific size and position for this, we'd perhaps first of all size the cutout down, position it to the top left hand corner of the screen, and then spin it in any plane, like so. So there is a setup. Now if I wanted to translate that cutout across the screen, if I move this now, it's actually moving in one of its planes because it is a 3D cutout in a 3D space. If I literally want to translate the cutout across the screen, then by selecting screen I'm able to do that without any size change, although you will notice that because of our angle of view we're looking at the cutout more acutely on the right hand side of the screen. If I want to spin the cutout around and see the other side, then we can do that very simply. If I want to spin the cutout around and not see the other side, then I can select no back, and the cutout will disappear until it turns around to the front again. It's original all on the cutout. Size it down slightly. Now what I'd like to do is have a door opening effect on this particular cutout. So rather than spinning it around the Y-axis in the center of the screen like so, I want to spin it so that it turns on the left hand edge of the image, and I can do that very simply by selecting position and axis and repositioning the axis itself to the left hand side of the cutout, and then reselecting spin, and I can now move the cutout on its left hand edge. And of course that applies to any point on the screen. It doesn't actually have to be within the cutout. I can move the axis off the cutout completely, like so, and then spin it from that position. And again, I think the best thing to do here is to experiment with various different setups and try all of the different criteria within each menu to see exactly what kind of effects you can create. You'll notice that when I highlight any one of the boxes, I get a sub-menu of increase, decrease, quarter, half and whole. And this basically allows me to very quickly turn the image a quarter turn or a half turn or a whole turn. So if we put the axis back into the centre of that image and size it down again, and I want to say a half turn, then I can spin on the y-axis a half. And the cutout now has completely turned around 180 degrees. And I could do that again to bring it back to the front. But you notice now that we have entered in the menu here one complete turn. Now we'll move into the pin characteristics next, but before we do, I'm just going to go into the library and bring down some images to work with. Here's a background that we're going to use, and I'll save that on one of the temporary picture stores. And here's an image of a car. Now I'm going to cut this out, select the only box because I don't want to keep the first cutout on the screen. Of course, it's important again to remember that all of the multiple cutout features and facilities that we saw in the paste styles option are available also, of course, in 3D. Now we're cutting that image out. We'll bring back our temporary picture store, put the cutout back to its original size, and what I want to do now is actually place this cutout into that billboard. Now that would actually be quite difficult to do using the positional, spin and size characteristics. So I'm going to use something called corner pinning. And again, if we first of all just size the cutout down so we can see the background more easily, move into pin, and I now have the ability to stretch and distort this image on the screen either by pulling the corners or the edges of the cutout. And if we highlight the arrows in the corner, you can see it's very simple now to pull the cutout out and to make it fit the billboard precisely. Now you can do this by selecting the live arrows on the screen, or of course we can do it by pre-selecting an arrow in the menu and just pushing across the screen like so. So again, if we have a very small cutout or are unable to actually pinpoint the live arrow on the screen, we can do that by pre-selection in the menu. And of course, as I say, that applies to the tags and the edges of the image. Now it's also possible, if we size the image down now, to actually change the size of the graticule we're working in. So for example, what I can do is actually pull the corner pin graticule outside the background. And there are various instances where this would be very useful to gain more control over the image you're working with. And once we go back to the arrows again, we have the same control we looked at a few moments ago. Now of course you can mix any one of these corner pin setups with the positional, spin and size characteristics at the same time. Obviously the flexibility and the opportunities that are presented to you with the Paste Up 3D menu are virtually limitless. And again, I think it would be a good idea if you spend quite some time playing with the 3D perspective option and trying out various different examples and exercises so you become very familiar with this part of the system. If you find yourself doing a lot of work with bar charts and graphs, complex diagrams and a lot of TD work as well, then perhaps the advanced graphics option is something you should take a close look at. Over the next few minutes, again, we're not going to go through a box-by-box blow of the advanced graphics option, but we're just going to look at some of the differences and advantages that you find in the option over the entry-level system graphics menu. So first of all, let's go into the library and bring down a background to work with. And we'll put that into one of the two temporary picture stores. Into the graphics menu, and here we can see one or two changes already over the entry-level system graphics. So let's start with curves. Now curves allow you to produce, if you like, the equivalent of French curving on the Paintbox system, and work in two main modes. That is basically an open curve or a closed curve. Let's start off with an open one. Choose a brush size, because again, whatever brush size you work with applies itself to the curve you're producing. And of course the same goes for brush type, so we're working with a paint brush in this particular instance. Swipe off the screen and tap down, and we're immediately presented with a line that has been tacked at one end. Every time I tap on the screen, I insert another edit point in that curve, and I can go on ad infinitum with this line until I'm happy with the result. Now, when my pen is in proximity, I can see all of the edit points on that particular line, and I can move them to any other point on the screen, like so. And of course, if I want to, I can remove any or all of them as well. So just by simply selecting delete and selecting that particular point, I can take one of the edit points off the line. Now, if I want to move one point without affecting any others around it, then all I need to do is simply lock the relevant points beside it, so that part of the screen, that part of the line doesn't move. And I can do the same thing on the other side, lock the point. So now I'm just moving that one part of the curve. When I'm happy with the final result, then all I simply need to do is just hit stick in the menu here to confirm that onto my image. And of course, that will work equally well in stencil as in picture. And don't forget, of course, that when you've created your curve, you must stick it down and then delete from the screen, because the buffer in the curve facility has room for one curve setup. So before you start a second curve, you must remove the first one you worked with. Now, the second mode that the curves work in is as a closed curve. Let's change our paintbrush style here. We'll have an airbrush, and we'll have a slightly larger brush, and we'll change the colour. Back into the graphics menu, curves, and this time closed. Again, we have that familiar line. We pull across the screen, tap down, but this time we have effectively a loop, like so. And again, we can move that around the screen, adding points, taking away points. And even in the middle of a curve, I can change the brush size, like so, and the brush type, like so. So that's actually during the setup of a curve. So extremely flexible indeed. The tangent facility allows you to actually twist any single one of the edit points, like so, and to change the degree of curve on it by pulling in and out. So we can actually get a tighter curve on that point. So if we move this one into the screen a bit further, like so, you can see we've almost created a point there, like so. If we literally wanted to create a point at any one of these edit points, then we just select straight, tap on the relevant edit point, and you can see now that we have a very sharp angle on that particular part of the curve. And if I want to, I can put that back to a round simply by selecting round and selecting the point again. The filled function allows me to do precisely what it would suggest, and that is create a filled line. Obviously, that's going to work better if you have a paintbrush style as an outline. And as I re-edit that curve, then the filled effect re-edits as well. And of course, as I said before, to remove that all from the screen, you simply delete all. So let's go on now and have a look at the other facilities within the Advanced Graphics menu. And as I said earlier, I'm not going to go through every single aspect because a lot of it is very straightforward and obvious. But there are one or two areas where things are rather subtle, and I'd like to go through those with you. Rectangles, circles, ellipses, as before, but one of the most important aspects you notice now is that as I reselect each one of these menus or sub-menus, you'll notice that we have a particular graphic shape appearing on the screen. Now, this is a memory which we now get within Advanced Graphics. It remembers the last rectangle or circle or ellipse or line that you created, and it places it in the same position on the screen and the same size that you created it the last time you were in that part of the system. Very useful function indeed. The other major change now in Advanced Graphics, apart from the obvious additions of parallel lines, radial lines, filled rectangles and so on, is the fact that the graphics work in two different states. That is, they work in the very traditional state when the menu is off the screen, i.e. if I produce a rectangle now, I tap down, I pull out, I tap down again, and there is my confirmed rectangle on the background. However, if we just restore the picture there, if I work with the menu on the screen the rectangle is live until I decide to actually confirm it and stick it down as part of the picture. So there's that same rectangle we just produced a few moments ago, but I can now move this around the screen. I can reposition it. I can resize by selecting an edge of the box. I can make it larger both in the vertical and the horizontal plane, or smaller of course. And then by selecting the middle of the picture, the middle of the shape, I can reselect its position. And that applies to every shape within the graphics facilities. So a very powerful addition indeed to advanced graphics. One of the other things you'll notice in advanced graphics is the tangential facility, which is found in both circles and ellipses. Let's have a look and see how that works. Tap down on the screen, pull out, produce a circle in the traditional method with the menu off the screen. Swipe the menu onto the screen and I now have the memory of that circle, of course, to reposition anywhere I want. But what if I actually wanted to produce a second circle that ran directly off the line, the circumference of the first circle? Well, then by picking tangential, what I can do is actually tap down on the line of the previous circle, and now rather than pulling a circle from the center, I'm pulling it out from the edge, like so. And that, as I say, works just as easily in ellipses as it does in circles. Change the brush size and color, go into ellipses, and there we can see the same thing again there. And of course we've got angle here as well, so if we produce an ellipse like so, then using angle we can very simply turn that to any degree on the screen, or of course using the soft keyboard here we can put a specific angle into the box, like so. Okay, one of the other additions you'll notice on advanced graphics is the grid menu, which has now been added to in various different ways. Obviously we've got the same horizontal and vertical gridding system that we've used before, but we've got a nice addition now, tabulation, which allows us to actually set up a tab on specific parts of the screen, like so, and use those as reference to work from within any grid that we then set up across the image, like so. And most of the other functions perform in very much the same way as the grid on the standard entry-level system. Before we leave this module, let's just have a look at another addition to advanced graphics, and that is the glue function. So we'll select glue first of all, and then we'll move through the graphics menu, just creating a few lines and rectangles to work with on the screen. So here are some connected lines, like so. We'll move down into the rectangles menu, select a different colour, and we'll just edit the one we already have on screen there and stick that down. Move into circles, change the colour again, and we'll translate the one we have across the screen and we'll enlarge it slightly and stick that down. Moving into ellipses, we'll put the menu at the top of the screen. We'll change colour first. And we'll reposition the ellipse, change its angle, something like that perhaps, and just move it down to the bottom of the screen. And we'll stick that down. Right, now if we just take the menu off the screen, before we do, we'll put use on the glue. And you notice now that my cursor, whilst remaining yellow most of the time, changes to blue as it snaps to specific points on all the graphic shapes. So it's going to the corners of the rectangle. It's going to the junction points of the straight lines. It's going to the centre of the circle and to the circumference. And it's going to the circumference and the centre of the ellipse. Very useful function which allows me, of course, to construct new shapes that are precisely lined up with graphics that are already produced on the screen. So that's the glue function. And again, when you finish with that and when you change the graphics, don't forget to clear the glue function so you're ready to set up for a new graphic on the screen. So there we are. That's the advanced graphics facility that's one of the options available for Paintbox, and I hope the last few minutes has been useful for you and perhaps has helped to guide you through the various features and functions of this option. Paintbox's animation option gives you 3 new facilities to add to your Paintbox. They are namely cell animation, sequencing, and external video recording device control. And we'll start off by looking at that part of the option. Now you can see, of course, first of all, the animation menu has appeared in the left-hand set of sub-menus, and if we go straight into that sub-menu, you can see we have Sequence, Cell and VTR. Now in this instance it's saying VTR because we do in fact have control from the Betacam on the right-hand side of me, but we could just as easily take control of a disc recorder such as an A60. At the bottom of the screen we have an extension of the front panel controls, so we can shuttle forwards and backwards, we can actually jog on the screen using the pen, and of course we can rewind and play in the normal fashion. The bottom right hand box shows us our current time code, and you can see it moving there. Just stop the tape and run it backwards. The box above is telling us the status of the recorder at any one point in time, and the controls, or the boxes at the top of the menu here, are giving us control over the frames that we feed into and play out from the Paintbox system. So first of all, for any frames that we want to feed into the system, we enter a start time code in the bottom of these 2 boxes. So for example, if we wanted to take the frame that we're parked on now into the system to work on, we simply enter that as our start frame. The set box has now readjusted itself to that particular frame, and that will always sit there showing us that that's the start point of that animation until we load that frame in. So if we want to load the frame in now, we simply hit the buy box, the tape will pre-roll, go into play, the menu will disappear from the screen at an instant that we're recording that frame, like so, and then it will go into standby. And what's happened in fact is that the set box on the right hand side is now increased by 1 frame, telling us that would be the next frame we would feed into the system. And if we go into any other menu on the Paintbox now, we can see that we've grabbed that specific frame. Exactly the same thing happens with the upper set of controls, but these refer to playing out to tape, so recording to tape from the system. And again, you set your start point and you sell a single frame at a time onto a recording device, in this instance, as I say, the VTR. So really that's all there is to it, a very straightforward menu, and giving you full control over the external recording devices that we're using. Okay, let's go into 2 other parts of the animation menu now. They are namely Sequence and Cell, and we'll start off with Sequence. Sequence is a facility within the system that allows you to record your hand movements across any part of the system, be it in the menu or on the screen. And it allows you to save it on the library and retrieve it and play it as a one-off or play it as a loop. So let's make a simple sequence up to see exactly how it works. What I'm going to do is actually write a word on the screen, record it using the sequence, and then replay it using different paint setups. So what I'll do is I'll record on cue, which means that I'm going to use button 2 on the rat to set off my recording. Go into the painting menu, selecting a paintbrush and a colour, I shall write the word paint on the screen. So we start recording by pressing button 2, and you'll notice the cursor will go red. Write the word paint, like so. Stop recording by pushing the button again, and the cursor has gone back to being yellow. Swipe off the screen, go into the animation menu, and now select replay on cue rather than record. So we just hit the on cue box, and again we'll replay on button 2 on the cue. Back into painting, wipe the screen to black, select this time an airbrush, and we'll select a large airbrush, and we'll rerun that cue, starting, remember this is very important, starting at precisely the same part of the system that we recorded from. That was, i.e., in the painting menu with the menu off the screen. And there's the first layer of that replay of the sequence. Now I'll go into the palette and choose a smaller brush and make it slightly lighter. Swipe the menu off again and replay. And there you can see exactly the same animation, but this time using a different brush size. Reduce the size yet again, lighten it slightly, stick with the airbrush, swipe the menu off, replay on button 2, like so. And now using an even brighter brush, I'll change to paint and run it once again. And there we can see the final result. So obviously a very useful facility. It allows you to copy exactly your hand movement and replay it. This can be used with smudge and smear, special brush effects, And more importantly, one of the most useful aspects of sequencing is that it allows you to record a repetitive sequence that you're creating on the system. If you had, let's say, a sequence of animation that you were putting together and you wanted to smudge all the frames to give them a painterly feel, then you could set up a sequence, smudge one frame, and then run that as a sequence through all the frames in that sequence, either loading them down from disk or bringing them in, buying them in from the camcorder. And then you can lay them back onto the camcorder or back onto the disk, again using a sequence, all having been smudged or smeared to give you the final result. So that's sequence. Let's move on now to the last of the three facilities we were looking at, and this is cell animation. So first go into the graphics menu and select circles. Select a brush size, and in Draw, Stencil and Add, we'll set up a number of radiating circles which will become the animation on this picture. Now that's the maximum number that I want to use, so I'll reverse the stencil, and in Paste Up I'll cut that out. And it's important here to try and make that cut as tight as you can to the area you're interested in, because that will basically dictate the number of cells that you'll fit on the screen at any one time. So now we'll go into the animation menu and we'll replicate that cell. And there immediately on the screen you can see that the system has managed to actually fit 12 separate cell images on the screen with which we can actually produce the animation. So what I've got to do now is, back in the painting menu, is just remove the various elements from each frame which will allow me to create a radiating circle for this particular cell stack. I'll just increase the brush size there. Now I do this to each frame, and the reason that I've actually replicated the same set of radiating circles and then removed elements from them afterwards is because it guarantees that I've got a registered circle that has a consistent size throughout. If I wanted the circle to get larger and thicker at the same time, then I could actually enlarge a cutout, and I could use a grid from the graphics menu to set up the center of each cell, because of course when we're using cell animation you have a cell grid facility within the grids in graphics. Now this is obviously going to take a few minutes, so I'll just complete these and we'll come back in a few moments to look at the final result. Okay, so we're just completing the last cell that we actually want to work with on this animation. As you can see, we've got 7 that we're going to use out of the 12 that were available. Now it's a very simple process to turn these 7 separate cells into an animating stack. All I do is simply go back into the animation menu, and this time I select the Make Stack menu, swipe off and tap down on each frame or cell that I'm using. And if I just hold the pen down on the next one, you can see the information we get at the top of the screen is telling us that we have one frame being selected, it's cell number 4, and the running time in real time would be 0.16 of a second in this instance. So there's the 5th, 6th and 7th cells, and I can go on reselecting those ad infinitum. I needn't just actually select each cell once. I could now make a random animation if I wanted and select them as many times as I wanted. Swiping off the screen will automatically make the stack, and in a few moments we'll be able to run that over our background. So if I switch the stencil off and restore the picture we had, then as a single shot in this instance, I'm going to cycle the stack, swipe off the screen, bring in our animation cell, and using the spacebar on the keyboard, I can fire off the animation. If I wanted that to go perhaps a little slower, then I could drop the frame rate back to 15 frames a second, bring the cell back in, and fire from the spacebar. If I wanted to loop that, perhaps back at 20 frames, I can do that very simply, just by selecting loop, and I get an automatic loop on the animation. Or if I wanted to, I could reverse the animation as well, so it would run backwards. Like so. So it's running forwards and backwards in a loop. And of course, if I wanted to change the colour of that, then I could have just wiped the screen to a different colour before I made the stack, making sure, of course, that I kept the stencil information. Well, this opens up all kinds of possibilities for small, simple animations which you can lay over various different graphic backgrounds, particularly suitable, of course, for current affairs and news graphics, where you want to highlight a particular part of the screen or show a small animation just to give a little bit of a boost to an otherwise still graphic. So there we are, that's the cell animation facility, which I think you could find particularly useful in news and current affairs graphics production, where you can obviously highlight specific parts of a map or graphic, and of course boost and add a little bit of life to an otherwise still graphic. And in the animation option as well, of course, we've seen Vtr control, or rather I should say external recording device control, because you can of course control an A60 as well. And apart from the Betacam that we've been controlling today, you can of course control any component analog VTR that has Sony protocol. And don't forget of course the sequence that we've looked at, which I think you can find would be extremely powerful in all kinds of different areas within the system. As I say, not only for recording your hand movements in, say, the painting menu where you want to repeat a particular kind of move, but also for creating a repetitive effect which you can save on the library and bring back into the system and run, of course, over a number of frames. Of course, the ultimate Paintbox option is the ramcorder, giving almost 13 seconds of animation that's RAM-based. Along with the RAM store, you also of course get full control over VTR both into and out from the system. Now the ramcorder itself can be seen down here to my right, and it consists of a mainframe unit that's the same size as the Paintbox. So, if we go into the menu now, let's have a look at the major facilities and features that you'll find in the ramcorder option. First of all, you'll notice the store length is 323 frames in PAL, and the bottom line on the store is in fact our entire store duration, and the top line is our current clip, and we'll see how that works a little better in a few moments time. First of all though, let's go and see the Vtr Control Mechanism, and on the right hand side of course I have the VTR now, so I'll load a tape into it, and then we'll go into VTR Control like so, and now you can see the menu has changed to include all of the front panel controls on the Betacam. So I can jog and shuttle through this. Using the pen on the screen I can jog by making circular movements, or by using the bar at the bottom of the menu I can shuttle through that clip. And using that process of course I can find precise in and out points for the clip that I'm working with, mark an in code, shuttle down the tape, or of course actually mark in a duration if we know it, and then at that stage we can mark an out point. Once we've done that of course we need to make clips, and this gives us a duration on the system. So in actual fact that's a little long, so I'll adjust that. So I've got exactly 4 seconds loading into the system now from the Betacam. All I need to do now is simply hit VTR to background. You see the VTR pre-roll, and in fact all of the controls are being shown on the screen as we go through the various states. That's now playing, and when the menu disappears it's loading onto the RAM store directly from tape. Now that's stopped, we'll eject the tape and we'll come out of the VTR control and back onto the desk, and there is our final piece, and we now have the ability to play out to the background, tap the screen, and there is that material loaded directly from tape. And of course it's totally non-linear and random instant access, so I can jump to any single frame, or I can put a frame number into the current frame box. The green box is current frame, the blue box is the duration of the whole desk. Background and result boxes in the centre of the screen indicate the clips that we're working from as our background, and the part of the RAM store that we're recording to with our additional animation added to it. And again you'll see more easily how that works later on in this part of the tape. So there is a piece of material loaded in from tape. You can see how simple the process is there to actually access that material. What we're going to do now is actually take this finished piece as an example and rebuild part of it to show you how the ramcorder actually operates. So the first thing I need is the background itself, and this is very simply loaded onto the RAM store as a still just by selecting a frame number. Let's say we'll run from frames 201 to frame 300, so that gives me a 4-second still on the background. I've loaded that into my background, and you see the desk illuminating in pink now to indicate the area that I'm working to, and I simply hit record to background. On the right hand side I've selected still, tap the screen, and we're now recording 4 seconds of that onto the RAM store. and there is my background to work with. Now the next stage, if we go back to the original piece, obviously is to lay various pieces of graphic over the background to give us that final result. Well, what we've done is in fact partly built this already, so if I just move to a different part of the RAM store, this time frames 101 to 200, and let's just play out the project so far, and there you can see we've actually put the boat on and we've put the words trains and boats on. So the next step here is to add the train. So we'll go into the library now and we'll bring down a cutout. Let's put the title in the box there. There it is. And we'll load that into the paste up menu. And as we do, you'll see there's a change to the system immediately, which we didn't see in the paste up 3D module. And that of course is the timeline at the bottom of the screen. And this allows us to specify particular durations for an animation that is going to be laid over the RAM store. In this instance, we're going to run this for about 60 frames, and as you can see, we have that loaded already onto the timeline. So let's reduce the size of the train, and we'll spin that around on the y-axis, and in fact I need to go by half a turn, so I'll use the half box. Place the menu at the top of the screen, and we'll now position the train down at the bottom of the picture like so. Now, by selecting background clip on the right hand side of the screen, I'm able to see the background animation as it happens behind the new foreground layer that I'm adding on, which of course gives me superb control over the next layer of animation. Okay, there's the move. Now in actual fact, the piece of store that we're working to is 100 frames long, so we'll need to increase the timeline to 100 frames. That's very simply done just by opening the right hand of the two boxes and putting, in this instance, 100 in there. And that's now increased the duration of my timeline. So I now have a 4-second timeline. There's the animation. I need to add my material over the top of it. And I want the train to come in from the left-hand side. And there's a little trick here which we're going to use, which basically is to reposition the axis on the far left-hand point of the train. And what this allows me to do is then, by using the size, is to make it appear that the train is actually running in from the left-hand side of the horizon, whereas in actual fact all we're doing is increasing its size. So the beginning of the animation will make about so big. I'm working in auto here, so that point has now been automatically entered as a keyframe. Had I been working in manual, then as soon as I'd entered a different statistic into any one of the positional, spin, size characteristics on the screen, then I would have had a little orange box appear like this one here saying edit. And as soon as I tap that, the point is entered. But for the purposes of this exercise, I'll leave it in auto. Move down to frame 60, which is the point at which the train is going to stop, and we'll size the image up, like so. That's the final point, and again I've got an automatic keyframe point, which you can see there is a little white line on the timeline on the screen. Now, what I want to do is profile the move as it comes in. I want a linear move as it starts in on the left-hand side, and a profiled stop. Now, the system will default to a profile stop, but I have to select the linear into or out of any keyframe point. So here, in fact, the linear move from the first keyframe. So I select linear from. And there is the move. And that will slow down and stop at the end, and then hold that position right through to the end of the animation. And at the very beginning, I'm going to use the translucency control to drop that cutout right back to 0 at the start, so I can mix it in over the first 15 frames of the animation. Enter another edit point there. Move back to the beginning. I choose to animate this in fields, which will give me a much smoother animation feel to the whole clip, and then I just hit do it. And that's now processing over the material that I've already been working on. Now in this instance, I'm actually processing the clip over the original piece. But you have the option at all times to select a different part of the RAM store for your result against your background, so that if you actually want to change the animation at any point in time, you always have the previous stage safely stored on the RAM store. So once this is finished processing, we'll go into that part of the system and you can see precisely how that would operate. See the train there coming to a stop. That's the profile stop, of course. And once it has stopped, then it will just repeat the cutout for the next 40 frames while the boat moves into its final position. And there you can see it's now stopped. Of course, I could have processed more than one cutout at the same time here. Just as we can use multiple cutouts in the Paste Up 3D perspective menu, we can also use multiple cutouts in the ramcorder. But I think it's a good idea when you're learning to use the system to set off with one cutout, get to know the keyframes, get to know how to use the menus in conjunction with the ramcorder, and then move on to multiple cutouts when you're confident with that part of the system. So there's the final piece. If we go back to the store now, we'll play that out by hitting Play Out Result. And there is the animation. Now, had I wanted to actually have a safety copy of the background before I laid the train over it, then I've made the result a different set of values. So for example, I would have perhaps made that frames 201 to 300. That would have meant that the background, which is on frames 101 to 200, would not have been recorded over, but the background with the foreground addition would have been recorded from frames 201 to 300 on the ramcorder. Alright, well now we're ready for the next stage, so what we'll do is we'll go back into the library and we'll bring down this time a stencil for the text that appears in the sky. And there it is. Now to go with this, I also have a cutout. So we'll select a cutout from the library, like so. And if I just go into the store for a moment, we can see there that what I have is a soft edge cutout which will enable me to actually reveal the text on the screen. I'll pick a colour from the palette, and in this instance what I'm going to do now is bring down a keyframe which I've already created, showing you again of course that you can save and retrieve keyframes on the store. And here is the move for that particular cutout, moving down the timeline. So if I now use the stencil, that will reveal the text behind it like so. So very simply, all I have to do on this is a 40 keyframe move, change this from frames 101 to 200 to 161 to 200. And again, I'm going to work on the same part of the store. Okay, and now all I need to do is simply make sure that I'm happy with the point at which that appears on the animation. Hitting Try It, of course, will give us a preview, which is not in real time. Stepping back to the beginning of the timeline, I can now process it. Very important point to remember here. Wherever I stop on the timeline is the point from which the process will actually start. So should I actually stop at frame 22 and now hit Do It or Process, the animation will process from that point onwards. In this instance, I want to go from the beginning of the timeline, so I'll retrace my steps to the start of that keyframe move. Now, the advantage of actually being able to stop that keyframe move at any point on the timeline is that it allows you to stop the move, change the priority of the cutouts. Now, we looked at that in one of the earlier modules, and if you want to refer to that, please do feel free to go back down the tape and remind yourselves. But the important thing is that you can change the priority levels of each of the cutouts so that halfway through a move, what was in the background could now be animating in the foreground and vice versa. So it allows you to stop, change priority and reanimate from that point in the timeline. Okay, now we can see that we've added the next layer onto the animation, so we'll go back onto the desk as soon as that's finished recording and we'll see what that looks like. Just wait for the last few frames to process onto the store. There we are, and we'll go back and play out the result, and we'll change this so we play the whole of our animation. And there it is. So all that leaves us to do now is to actually put the plane over the foreground. So we go back into the library, cut out, look for the plane, bring it down, there it is, it's a cutout, into the Paste Up menu, size it down, and now selecting from the RAM store frames 161 to 200, which is where we've just been working, we set a time frame up of 40 frames, that's a keyframe timeline of 40 frames. We'll position the plane at the start of that move, size it down slightly more, spin it around, position it, and mark that as our first keyframe point, automatic edit there. Move to the end of the timeline, like so. Spin the plane around slightly, and move it to the end of the timeline, and move it to the end of the banner, of course. Spin that round a little more, like so. Move to the centre of the move, and just reposition the plane so it's now got a nice arc, like so. And there we can see the plane moving around the banner. And obviously we can fine-tune that to make it precise. Now, something else that's appeared on the screen now, which you won't have seen before, is this timeline, or the actual track of the animation we're producing, which is called stripy string. It shows us the track we're working on, it shows us each keyframe point we produced, and each stripe indicates one frame of real time in video. So that's a switchable option in the full page menu, which allows you to actually see the track of your animation. And regardless of the number of cutouts you have on screen, you'll see that for every single one of them as you select them. And obviously if we have multiple cutouts here, if we just copy the plane, so you can see how that works, just by hitting copy, I now have two planes. First one with its animation. Here's the second one, which we could perhaps run an animation on in a different direction. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the beginning of the timeline for it, and we'll give it a different move so you can see how that works. So we've selected that cutout. You can see the axis is over number 2 now, and here we have number 2 on the store. Move to the other end of the timeline, spin the cutout back, move it across the right hand side of the screen, and again perhaps give it an arc in the opposite direction now, so we'll go down with that. And now we can run them both together, and there are our two animations, and they'll both process together, and as I select each cutout you'll see the stripy string trail for each one. And of course that applies to cutouts from the library, not just copies made within the Paste Up menu. Now back into the animation menu itself, we have one or two other controls here which we'll very quickly look at. When we play out the material to tape, of course, we have exactly the same tape menu that we saw when we came in from VTR, only this time, of course, it's going out to VTR. We can loop the material, so it will actually keep on playing, like so. And we can reverse it and we can bounce it. So it will go forwards and backwards, like so. We can put pauses between frames, and if you refer to the manual you'll see exactly how that works. Again, that's a very straightforward task. You can just put in any pause duration between specific frames. And of course we have various other facilities on here that allow us to buy and sell single frames to and from the Paintbox into the RAM store. And that's very useful, of course, for rotoscoping. The buttons on the rat will actually help you at this point. If you take the rat and look at it, you have 4 buttons. 1, 2, 3 and 4, and each of these has a different function in the rotoscoping process with the RAM store. And in the painting menu you see you actually have a little reminder of what each one of those buttons do. Button number 1 is your next button. That will buy the next frame that you've marked in the RAM store and sell the one you've just been working on. Button number 2 will buy a frame into the painting buffer, but nothing else, it won't sell it back. Button 3 will preview the number of frames that you've pre-selected to preview in the full page menu or in the RAM store menu. And button 4, the sell button, will just sell a frame from the painting store or from any part of the paint system onto the RAM store. So for example, if I set this up to be frame 161 and sell frames 161, then I would buy the first frame in at this stage maybe, go into painting, and then you can see here I could use the next button, button number 1, and I could literally add frame by frame, go to the next one, 2, go to the next one, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And if we go back to the RAM store now, you'll see that we have those additions added, rotoscoped effectively to each one of those frames. And that's also possible in field mode. So by selecting fields, you can select field 1 or 2, and again in the painting part of the system or in any other menu, graphics, effects and paste up, you can actually work in a rotoscoping manner using fields instead of frames. So if you do forget what the buttons mean on the rat, don't forget it's here as a toggle on the painting menu. And if you switch that box, it will remind you which frame you're selling and which frame you're buying. So back in the RAM Store menu, I think we've covered the major facilities that you'll find in the RAM Corder option. Please do read the manual, and remember, try one cutout to begin with, don't try multiple cutouts. Get to know how to use the system, get to feel very familiar with the way that the 3D menu operates, and certainly how it operates in conjunction with the keyframing facilities in the RAM Corder. And I'm sure you'll have great success with this particular option on Paintbox. The Paintbox contour option offers three major facilities to the system. These are namely contour, which falls into turn, wrap and ripple, which is a true curvilinear DV effect working in 3D space. Global, which is the ability to group together your DV moves, and attached, which allows you to set up various subgroups within the global move. Now these last two functions, global and attached, are very much applicable, of course, if you are using the RAM Corder option on Paintbox. So let's go and have a look at the menu now and see exactly how the contour option is set up. In the Paste Up menu, if we have a cutout on our pen, so first of all we'll go into the library and we'll bring down a picture, which will turn into a cutout. So we'll use the picture of the clown here. So we'll cut the entire picture out using the Cut Picture All function. And then immediately we can see the Paste Up 3D menu appear, and right in the middle we can see the contour submenu with bend, wrap, turn and ripple effects. Let's start off by using the bend facility, and immediately you notice that we get a grid of dots over the image. If we just size this image down slightly so we can see the edge of the grid, there it is. Now any point that I pick up and move on the screen will of course push the entire image across in a contoured effect. And as soon as I've done that, you notice that I've actually targeted that point. Now the reason for this is that when you're actually building a keyframe in conjunction with the RAM Corder option, you have to identify every point at the start of a move that you want to move. So for example, if I were to actually want to move the top of the image down across a move, then by moving it slightly now, it's targeted it. And that means that now across the move, it will identify that point as a point that I want to move. Now if I didn't actually want that line to move off the horizontal, then I can use the undo function to take it back to its original position. But you notice the target still actually stays on that point. So I've targeted that point as an area that I want to move. I move to the end of my timeline and I move it like so. And if I now run down the timeline, you can see that contour effect actually being animated. And as I say, of course, this is applying to the RAM Corder option. If you're using a Paintbox without that option, then of course this is a still frame effect setup. We can do the same thing, of course, for any other point. And if we want to, of course, we can go back to the beginning of a keyframe move and retrospectively set up a move on that point. So if we now run through the timeline again, you'll notice both the top and the right-hand side are moving. And of course, I'm not just restricted to picking up points on the edge of an object. I can pick up points at any stage across the image. So for example, I could take a point just here within the picture and just pull down the image at that stage. And you can see the effect that's been created there. So this really is effectively turning your video image into a sheet of rubber and allowing you to move it in any way. But so far we've only moved it in two planes, and if I spin this image around now, because of course all of the contour functions are integrated and can be used with the positional, spin and size characteristics within the 3D menu. But here you can see now that whilst we have a contoured image in two planes, in the third plane we haven't done anything yet. So back into bend, pick up the Z plane now, and we'll pick the center point of the picture, and you see that we can push that down and pull it up accordingly. And if I now go back into spin again, you can see that we have a truly three-dimensional shape in a 3D space. that's been contoured using the bend facility. Now, if you want to work in particular area of the screen, then if I just stick this image down now and recut a small section and put that back to its original position, go back into the bend function, and you see now that our grid of little dots has appeared over a small part of the screen, and this obviously is going to give me far more control over movement of this part of the picture. Now again, by using the multi-cutout facility, there's no limit within reason to the number of cutouts we could have on the screen at any one time with a bend facility enabled on it. So I could have 3 or 4 separate cutouts across the image, each with their own grid allowing me to bend them in different directions. If we now go back to the full screen image, let's have a look at 1 or 2 other functions available within the bend facility. Now, what I'd like to do in this instance is just pull the nose away from the rest of the picture. And this can be done very simply by locking off points on the grid. So first of all, let's just reduce the size of the image again, and we'll spin it round slightly so we can actually see what's happening in a 3D space. Like so. And what I'm going to do now is go back into bend, and taking each one of the points that I'm interested in, I'm just going to move them very slightly, so I'm targeting that point, and then undo it. So I'm not actually moving it, I'm just placing a target point on it. And undo, 1 down at the bottom, and 1 on the left hand side. And what I shall do now is in the Z plane, pick the centre of the nose and pull it out. And now you can see it's not affecting the rest of the picture at all. If we spin that around, the rest of the image has stayed flat, and the nose, as you can see there, has been pulled out from the rest of the picture. So there we are, that's how you lock off points using the bend facility. Don't forget, the most important thing is if you're using bend in conjunction with keyframing in the camcorder, do remember that you need to identify any points that you're going to move across the timeline at the start of the timeline. If you don't identify them, the system can't recognise them as part of a move. Okay, let's put that back to its original shape and move into the second of the contour functions, and this is the wrap function. And what I'm going to do here is bring down a different image from the library. So we'll just remove that first one, go back into the library, and this time we're going to bring down a picture of the world. And we'll cut this out. And then using the wrap function, in the X or Y plane, I can literally roll or curl a picture towards us or away from us. And that again is a truly three-dimensional, there we are, as we can see, a truly three-dimensional turn. Now, interestingly here, of course, that'll work in both planes. If I want to, I can combine the two as well. So by using a wrap that, let's say, is 0.75 of a turn in the X plane and 1 complete turn in the Y plane, we can create a sphere. The reason we use 0.75 and 1 is because if you look at that, that's a 3:4 aspect ratio, which is the same ratio as the TV screen. Now we can go back into the spin function now and spin the image around, and we'll see that we haven't actually got a perfect sphere because we've actually got the picture at the top of the image being severely distorted because there's just too much of it. So what we do is go back into the wrap and use the Y size to decrease the amount of image that we have there. And there you can see it's getting better already. If we take that down to the lower figure again, we now have an undistorted image at the top. And you can see also on the top there, we haven't quite closed the sphere. So using the X size, we'll increase that to 1.01. And there you can see we're beginning to close it up. So with a little bit of work, you can get an extremely good effect. So that's the wrap function. And as I say, you can work in X and Y independently or the two together. If we go into turn now, we'll just put that back to its original size. Page turn gives us the ability to make a page turn from any part of the screen, bending forwards or backwards over, again, if you're working in conjunction with the camcorder, over a specific time space. So the first function we use is the wrap, and this sets up the amount of curl that we want on our page turn. And there you can see we're turning it towards us, and if I spin the cutout away, you can see that we have quite a loose curl on the page turn. We can actually produce almost a fold using that function. Then we set up the angle, and this basically means do we start from the bottom right, the top left, or the center, or wherever. And of course we can actually, again, if you're working with a ramcorder, then you can change that angle as you move. If you're working with a Paintbox without the ramcorder option, then obviously what you're doing is setting up a still frame effect. And then the start function allows you to place the page either on or off the screen, or at any point of the page turn at the start of your timeline. Move to the end of the timeline and set up the end position, which we'll have just there. And again, of course, the keyframing facility with the ramcorder option will work out all of those in-between stages for you. And it's a very simple task now to add highlights and lowlights to this image. I'll show you how we would do that. If we go back into the position functions, you're familiar, of course, with the no back facility that we've had on other options. Well, here we have a no front or a no back facility as a switch. So here, of course, we're looking at the back alone, and here we're looking at the front alone. Now, doing that and then substituting your cutout for a flat color, you can see very quickly how you can actually build a matte run, allowing you to put highlighting and low lighting through either on a still image, or again, if you wanted to do it frame by frame, on a moving page turn. The boxes, let's just put that back to the picture again. The boxes BF and FB we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail later on. So there's the page turn. The ripple function, we'll just go back and get our original image from the library for this one. So we'll work with the clown in this instance, and we'll just cut the picture again. The ripple function is a standard ripple effect which you can set up across any image you're working on, again either in still or moving state. What I'm going to do is wipe the screen down to black and just size this cutout down slightly before we go any further, so you can see the full ripple effect. And we'll spin it away from us as well, so we're looking at it in 3D. So the first function is the XYZ function, which allows us to create the size of the wave we're working with. And that's the height of the wave, the depth of the trough, and of course the width. If we want to change the ratio of the wave, then we can use the Z function alone, which will increase or decrease the height. Frequency, again, will increase or decrease the number of waves we have on any one cutout, like so. And if you're working in conjunction with the ramcorder option, then of course the start function enables you to set up the beginning point and of course the end point of your animation. And there we've just entered one into the timeline, so we'll just move down through that, and there you can see the move. The ripple defaults to running from the top left-hand corner and going radially across the screen to the bottom right. If you want to change the angle from which the ripple appears on your image, then you'll need to turn the image around and cut it out upside down or inside out, so the ripple will appear from the top right, the bottom right, or the bottom left. Now, quite an interesting fact here is if you want to create a translucent effect where you can see through the ripple, you can do that by simply cutting out the object you're working with, the element you're working with, through a semi-transparent stencil. And if I bring one down now that I've done that too, bring it into the screen, and I'll also bring down a keyframe that I've created. And what we'll do is we'll just wipe the picture to white so we can see more easily. And as I spin this around, you'll see we are literally looking through, it's almost like looking through a piece of silk. We have a semi-transparent cutout there on the screen. So there's another effect that can be created using the ripple option in Contour. So those are all of the ripple functions. If we take that back to its original state, we're now going to look at the global functions, and I'm going to bring down from the library, let's just take the only function off in Paste Up 3D. I'm going to bring down from the library a number of cutouts. We have 6 here in actual fact, so we'll fetch those down in order. Cutout number 1, let's just put that back to its original position. 2, there's the third one. And the last one. Into the Paste Up 3D menu, and here we can see that we have all the separate cutouts on the screen, and I can separate those in the usual fashion by selecting Control for each independent cutout, picking them up and positioning them across the screen. So we can see all 6 cutouts at the same time. Now this is where the global control of course comes into its own, because apart from having independent control over each separate cutout, the global facility, which we can see here in the centre of the menu, allows me to attach and move to all of the cutouts at the same time. So when I select global, you'll see the axis go blue, and now whichever function I have picked up in the 3D menu applies itself globally to every single cutout on the screen. So in this instance, position is being applied to all 6 cutouts, or spin applied again to all 6 cutouts. Now if you're working with a ramcorder option, then of course this is fully keyframeable as well, so you can apply these moves to any animation that you're producing on the ramcorder. At any point I can come out of global and go into local control, and now for example I could spin the T and I could go across to the letter P and turn that, down to the I and turn that, and now go back into global again by reselecting it and spin again, and you see now that we've got a truly 3-dimensional setup with all of those cutouts. And you notice that some of the cutouts are appearing to move behind when they should go in front. Well, at that stage of course all we need to do is simply come out of global, select that specific cutout and change its priority level until it comes into the foreground. There it is. And the same goes for the eye of course, so we can select that and just increase its priority level, so we now have the correct aspect on all of those pictures. You'll also notice that the global function has now gone blue. This is to indicate that we have a global setup in the system, and when you're normalizing the menu to move on to the next part of your animation, then it's very important to remember to normalize the global aspect as well. Now of course the global functions will work in conjunction with all of the spin, positional and size characteristics. Okay, so again I would recommend that you spend some time actually getting to know this part of the system and feeling comfortable with it before you move on to the next stage. So what we'll look at next is the attached function. So we'll original our global move and we'll original each of the cutouts in their various different spin positions. Okay, so what we'll do now is use the attached function to build a 3-dimensional shape with these 6 separate cutouts. And you'll notice the attached box appears only when you're in the positional menu. If you move into spin or size, it isn't there. So remember to work from the position menu when you're using attached. So let's start off by taking the letter P, placing it on the left-hand side of the screen, and then selecting the letter O, and we're going to attach the letter P to the letter O. So I attach, after having selected the P, the top edge to the bottom of the O, and I've done that by, I'll run through that again with the next letter, select the T, select attach, select the edge to be attached, tap the object you're attaching to. Let's do that again. We're going to select the I, select attach. We're going to attach the left-hand edge of the I, so we select that to the letter T. The O, attach the left-hand edge to the I. The N, we're going to attach the top edge to the bottom of the O. Now you're not just restricted in attaching edges. If we just look at them again, we can attach by edge, by corner or by face. So again, try all of those different things out. Now that we're attached, we have a hierarchical control over these cutouts. That now looks like a global move, but it is in fact an attached move, which means that the first letter O is the parent of all of the other letters. If I take the I, then every cutout every subsequent cutout after the I is taken with the letter I, so the I is the parent of those two cutouts, but the O still remains parent of all of them. So you can see how an attached move works. So basically the relationship between any two cutouts can remain fixed at any preset criteria that you care to set up. So for example, a good use of this would be perhaps to try and build a cube, which of course would be very difficult without this particular function. So we're going to use the spin characteristic on the P here. On the X plane, we will spin a quarter turn, and then we will spin the whole group towards us so we can see exactly what we've created, like so. In actual fact, we'll go back to the letter P and we'll spin that in the opposite direction. So it's now going to spin away from us, like so. Taking the group, again by the letter O, we'll spin it around. Now we'll select the T, and again this time we're using the Y plane. We'll put a quarter turn onto that, and again this time we'll decrease it, like so. Go back to the top cutout, or the parent cutout. Take the letter I, and again on the Y, we'll turn that by a quarter turn. Go to the O, and on the Y, by a quarter turn, go to the N, and this time again on the X by a quarter turn. So here you can see we built a cube, but in fact it doesn't look right yet because of course we've got various cutouts taking priority over other cutouts, so it gives us the wrong effect. So what we need to do is just look at all the fronts. And if I now spin that around, you can see that we can look at every single face of the cube. And that's fine providing we just look at the fronts, but if we open the cube back out, of course, by going to the letter N, so deselecting the global there, and literally opening up the letter N, with fronts only, it doesn't make sense. With backs only, it doesn't make sense. So what we're going to use is the BF and FB functions. These basically mean that you have priority of backs over fronts or fronts over backs. And spin the cutout around. You can see that we can see the outside of the cube properly and the inside. And there are one or two instances where that won't occur. If we get the N over the O, you can see we have a problem there. So all we need to do there is just switch priorities, either during a keyframe move if you have the ramcorder option, or of course if it's a still image, then all you need to do is change the priority of that one cutout. And again, it's important to try various different examples in the attached mode so you can get to know it better and feel comfortable using it. So those are the global functions, those are the attached functions, and we've looked at contour as well. If we just remove these cutouts from the screen, there's one or two aspects that we need to look at while we're in this particular option. I'll just bring down one cutout. Here we are. Now what you will notice, if you have the, just to originalise the global there, if you have the ramcorder option and you're working with that in conjunction with the contour option, you'll notice you have an enhanced keyframe facility in your timeline at the bottom of the screen. Basically what this enables you to do is, first of all, if we create a timeline here with the cutout, there's our stripy string. This little blue box is giving us the status of our cutout. It's telling us that we are between two keyframes. If I delete that last keyframe move, it's telling us that I'm after the only keyframe move on the timeline, which is at the beginning. So if I set up another one there, move back to the center and reposition, I've now got three keyframes, and instead of having linear to, linear from, we've got an arrow, an S and an arrow. And these are basically the same controls: linear into, linear from, or stopped. Now if you had a number of keyframes set up on the screen, and let's just put a couple of three more in here, it may well be that retrospectively you'd like to change that move. Let's just increase the number of frames on there a little. You may want to change this, what is obviously a curved move, into a totally linear move, and we can do that in one fell swoop just by hitting linear keyframes. And the entire keyframe move has now been changed to a linear move, or of course curved keyframes. Just delete that keyframe timeline out and build a new one. Set up our first position, move down the timeline, set up a second position, and a third, and a fourth. And you can see again here we have a curved timeline, a curved keyframe move. Now I select linear, and every point from here on is a linear move. And there you can see a linear move on that corner, and another one there. So those obviously are great benefits which have been added to the keyframe facility within the Ramcorder option. Now if I just copy this cutout, I'll show you something else that can be done. We obviously have a timeline for the first cutout. There it is. Okay. Now the second cutout we'll make a new timeline for, and we'll run from the other side of the screen. Position, put an end point in, put a midpoint in, like so. And we now have two moves on the screen at the same time. Now, if we wanted to delete one of those moves, in the past we would have deleted all of the keyframe moves at the same time. But here all I need to do is simply select the particular move I want to remove from the animation and hit Del Keyframes. And now my first keyframe move is still on the screen, but the second one has been removed. So that completes all of the elements that we're going to look at in the contour option. But don't forget, of course, a lot of what you've seen has been working in conjunction with the Ramcorder option. All of the contour features and facilities work within a Paintbox without the Ramcorder option, of course, as still imagery. If you've got the option of the Ramcorder, then obviously everything that you've looked at will animate on a timeline, and you can save all of the elements in keyframes on the library just as you have in the past with standard paste up 3D keyframe moves.